All right, review session today on language and language families. And I want to begin with this with what has been heavily asked about in the past and how this test is not going to talk about definitions as much, but they're going to expect you to be able to use application for terms and concepts related to language. So with that, lingua franca, dialect, accent, those are terms you have to know, hopefully through past lessons, notes, the book. You can review any of that. Maybe you have problems. A lot of people have messed up on lingua franca because what has to be in the definition of that term is it's when two groups of people would otherwise not be able to communicate. So they basically adopt or adapt to one language that allows them both to communicate. A lot of times it's a business language too, because that way they can trade, they can do common business, and also it may be a language that allows them to make a lot of money. Remember, there's a difference in dialect and accent. Dialect is more than just the sound. It's also the vocabulary. It's also spelling. So it's a bigger picture than just accent, which is just how something is pronounced when you're talking about a variation of languages. Now, as far as the language tree, and I'm sure this video is not going to answer all of your questions. I intend to tack on some other videos about this in the coming days and weeks. But we have to understand the process of language evolution. And so I want to review that, and I want to think about the kind of question you may get asked. See, if you look at the language tree, just like your family tree, this is what linguists believe has happened historically to languages. They believe that at one time there was a language in the world that, as people migrated and left family members and moved to other places and got isolated. As they become more isolated, as geography isolated them, then they begin to speak differently. They begin to have different words for things. And so therefore, what started as a variation of a language, a dialect, and this is how they believe a dialect becomes a language. After a long period of time, when you get to the point that you can't communicate with those people originally anymore, then it becomes a language instead of a dialect. Now, there is a very fuzzy line of, is it a dialect? Is it a language? Like Catalan in Spain for so long was considered a dialect. Now it's not by most people. Some people have made the joke that the difference in whether it is a dialect or a language is as simple as, do you have your own sovereign state? Think about that. It does make a lot of sense that the political motivations may drive home. If you have your own state, then you have more declaration of, hey, we are unique. This is our national identity. Or if you don't, if you're a stateless nation, it's more likely some people will view your language as a dialect because they don't see you as having the right to have your own culture, so to speak, independently. Instead, they would call it a variation. So notice the political connection. But also it's important to understand if that hypothesis by linguists is true, then what we've got is over time, these tree trunks are what's called proto, P-R-O-T-O, original languages. And we don't know much of anything about these original languages other than the hypothesis they existed. Remember, we studied two theories about this one. This is the tree you have to know in detail. Indo-European, most widely spoken language family in the world. Mandarin's the most widely spoken language, but Indo-European is the widest spoken family. And we said there's the Kurgan hearth theory, which comes from the Russian steppe lands of the Southwest. And there is the Anatolian hearth theory that says this language here was spoken by farmers in the area of Turkey. If you forgot those, please go back and review those. But through time, as people moved, whether it was from Turkey or Russia, they begin to encounter different climates, different foods, different animals, and therefore they begin to speak differently and to have different ways of communicating. And that's how they believe languages develop. So you have different branches of the language tree that then shoot off in different directions. So what you're saying is, as you get down toward the roots of the tree, that's the furthest back in history we can go. Below this little black line, we have no clue because there's no written history. There's just projection, theory, that this is, because notice what happens below the black line. these trees all come together. We can't prove that. That's hypothetical. If what happened above the tree is thought to be true, then you can understand why they would think that. So if you're looking for how would I look at a language tree, this could be a good question. And know when there's been a recent divergence of a dialect to a new language, where would that be? Well, that would be up here at the end of a tree, at the end of a branch, because this is recent. This is older down here at the bottom. Just like the tree roots and trunk were established before some of these branches out here at the end, that's the same thing time-wise with language families. So you've got to understand the evolution process, okay? You've got to understand the evolution process before you can actually see how to answer application stuff. So here's what we've got with the language trees. Notice again, some like Japanese and Korean have one tree trunk and then they have one leaf on them. What that means is we cannot prove that they are related to any other language. And remember how you prove it. How do linguists study that today? They prove it by measuring words like numbers and animals and saying, do they relate from one language to another? And if several of those do, they can make a hypothetical connection that there's probably a relationship there. But Japanese and Korean, there's been no proof of that, all right? So as we study the trees, then you're going to look at also mapping these trees. You got to know where Sino-Tibetan is found. Now, that's pretty easy as long as you think, look, most widely spoken language in the world is Mandarin Chinese. Now, Mandarin Chinese is also an official language of the country of China. It is not the only Chinese language. Why do you have an official language? Typically, governments want a centripetal force, pedal. They want everybody to know in important business, in education, we're all communicating in this version to solve confusion, to bring together. So Mandarin not only is a specific language, but it is also an official language, as opposed to also it may be deemed a standard. Now, every language can have a standard form. A standard form is a form in which people say these are the formal proper rules for how this language should be spoken. So then we know that Mandarin is Chinese. So we look at a map and we know this yellow area is where Sino-Tibetan is going to be. Now, I know you're going to be able to look stuff up on the test potentially if they had a question like this, but the application stuff you won't be able to look up. So knowing, oh yeah, Sino-Tibetan, that's China and the area to Southeast Asia, and there's dialects. Like, could you talk about how that where would Chinese have its most variation? East Coast, Western areas, Southern areas? Probably the best answer is going to be Western and Southern in other countries to the south, because Eastern China is so populated, it's probably become, and it's more advanced economically, it's probably become more a global version of Chinese and more a global version of Mandarin over time, okay? And then we need to map and say, okay, so what can we talk about these others? You know, this pink coloring here is Afro-Asiatic. Hebrew and Arabic are both in that language family. You also know that you have, now one thing they do on this map I don't like, they, instead of labeling the different African families like Nilo-Saharan and Niger-Congo, they just labeled African languages. That's not a great example of things, because you know that one thing that language shows us is cultural diversity or homogeneous nature. So in Japan, you see a very homogeneous language trait. But in Africa, in the continent of Africa, and in countries and states in Africa, you see an extreme diversity, which means if their language is diverse, their religion is probably diverse, the ways they believe are diverse, and the chances of these people, fugal, centrifugal forces, getting along are more challenging. Remember, this purple over here is Amerindian, whereas the green, native population, is the purple. The green, all this green you see, is Indo-European. Some of it through colonization, others through the Germanic tribes and their versions of their languages. This tree is the one, again, you need to be familiar. Sure, you could look some of this stuff up if you're asked on the test, but practicality. Again, let's be simple here. Germanic branch of Indo-European, Northwestern Europe, Protestants and English speakers, well, I said Protestants and Germanic speakers like English, German, Swedish, so forth. Romance, Southwestern Europe. Romance languages, Catholic faith, Southwestern Europe. Slavic, this next branch, Eastern Europe, Russia. Orthodox religion of Christianity, Orthodox branch of Christianity, Eastern Europe. And then finally, Indo-Iranian from basically parts of Turkey all the way over to India and Bangladesh. You have this separate branch, very wide, a lot of speakers that diverged in that direction, which is why we give a potential hearth in Turkey or Russia for the Indo-European language family. So what I think you might be asked is they may show you a chart or a graph. They might even show you the language tree. And then what they're probably going to ask you is, given this scenario or given these numbers, how would you explain how this language evolved into 3 dialects? Or how would you explain how language in Spain or how language in the old Yugoslavia helps to show the devolution of those places? Yugoslavia had many dialects, which now are called languages. So symbolically, devolution, the devolutionary forces were different cultural groups inside Yugoslavia. And the result of devolution was those cultures diverging even more and creating independent languages. Okay, follow that. India is a great study with language. Multitude of diversity. Because of that, there is a high demand for a lingua franca, such as Hindi or English. Same thing in Nigeria. So in essence, these lingua francas bring centripetal forces, especially to the middle class and above, that can allow them to communicate. But a lot of times they don't penetrate the lower economic classes, which therefore could bring economic differences that cause an issue, right? And I know that we're just touching on some things right here, but I'm trying to push you toward the thinking questions as opposed to the memorizing questions. Dravidian is spoken in southern India. You might be asked, so what does Dravidian have to do with the Sri Lanka conflict? Well, Dravidian is spoken by the Tamils, one of the ethnic groups that had been fighting the Sinhalese, who are Buddhist, in Sri Lanka. The Tamils wanted to form their own sovereign state there, and so they fought a civil war against the Sinhalese, who are not Dravidian speakers, but instead they are of the Indo-Iranian branch of the Indo-European tree in that area. Okay, so language tells us a lot. The Japanese are very protective of their culture, and they basically have one culture for the most part. Okay. Also, don't forget syncretism, the blending of culture, which is also present a lot of times in language families. So this is what I hope this has done, this video. I don't want it to be too long. I hope it's kind of refreshed your mind of language a little bit. I do plan on some other stuff with language. Also, I'd like, if you maybe have questions on this, on some of the Zoom we do later this week, this is where you can bring in some of those questions. Say, hey, can I have practice with this? But I will leave you with this thought. I'm trying to leave these review videos with some questions, some practice questions. How might a language that is a minority language, in other words, it's a minority everywhere. There's no dominant state. There's no state that it's a dominant language in. Remember that? How might a minority language try to strengthen its ability to survive? What methods politically and socially, culturally, might it use, and what are the challenges to it? That's a great practice FRQ. What challenges would a minority language face, and what are some avenues politically, socially, and culturally that it could try to put in place to help its language survive into the future? Think about key concepts that help with that, but also think about like detailed processes. Here's how it would happen, word for word, detail for detail of how that would take place. Hope this has helped some. This is not the end all be all. Don't forget to use maps when it comes to languages. This is not the greatest one. It just was showing up the clearest right now for me to show you. But use these and say, okay, so what do I know? Can I explain distribution patterns? Not only where they are, can I also explain why they're there? Why is Indo-European where it is? Why is Dravidian where it is? Why is Altaic where it is? Why is the Basque where they are? What happened there? You've got to walk through that process and explain why. So focus on the why, think about the application. And we'll continue talking about language. I'm pretty sure over the next 3 weeks, we're probably going to talk quite a bit more about language.